will do that once he goes. So hopefully we'll have some interesting graphs later on. But I really just wanted to talk about the motivation for 176. So the actual ACP lists the two kind of top level motivations. So the first one I want to point out is the one that we talked super briefly about, or Meg just talked about super briefly, which is the dynamic gas target. So currently, whenever we want to suggest a change to the gas target, it has to go through the ACP process, and it has to get adopted by network validators, so on and so forth. And because the gas target is something that realistically is probably going to be changing at a relatively fast clip as we kind of turn our focus into C-Chain performance, we are suggesting in this ACP to remove the gas target from the ACP process and have it just directly be voted on by the validators on the live network. So essentially what this is doing is this is allowing validators to kind of on the fly change the gas target as optimizations and improvements, or just like as willingness to increase hardware requirements happen, right? So that's really a big kind of unlock here, but that doesn't necessarily require a whole new fee mechanism. That's just something that can easily get bundled into this new mechanism. So one of the things that we've kind of noticed looking through the mainnet data is that the existing mechanism can result in these like outsized fee spikes. So what does that mean? That means that even though the demand curve has, say the demand curve shifts upwards, so people are willing to pay more for gas, there has to be some rate limiting mechanism, so the price of gas will increase. But the existing mechanism has this kind of like momentum that can get created. And so the fee can actually kind of increase probably further and faster than it should. And Austin's going to go through some of the graphs and show some specific cases where that can happen and get into kind of an unhappy state. So I'll let him kind of show some different simulations in a sec. The other thing that is included inside of this ACP that isn't one of the top two kind of motivations, but is another thing to point out, is the switch to have a min gas price that is essentially as small as we can set it on the technical side. And essentially what this is intending to do is guarantee that the C-Chain is always in a period of price discovery. So, we have, for many network upgrades in the past, we started, I think, at 470 nanovox as the base, as like the fee. Then we lowered it to maybe 225. I think then it was 75, and then 25. We set it to 1 in Etna. But we're still seeing that if you look on the mainnet statistics, that we're frequently around a 1 nanovox. So sometimes it spikes up when demand increases, but we oftentimes are around that kind of 1 nanovox. And really that just means that we're not utilizing our dynamic fee mechanism at all. So this is suggesting to just kind of set this to the floor, as small as we can go, which will guarantee that we're always in a period of price discovery. So what that means is during periods of low demand, gas will be as cheap as possible, but it will still react upwards during periods of high demand. And then I think the last thing, this is also something that Austin's going to show in some of his graphs, is the current mechanism does not actually hit the target that it sets is targeting. So currently we target 15 million gas per 10 seconds with the current mechanism. And if you actually look at the statistics on mainnet, we do not actually hit that. In fact, we actually run over that. So the current mechanism isn't actually very good at hitting the target that it is set to, whereas this new mechanism will hit the target that it's set to. So it basically just allows us to be a little bit more scientific about the exact like targets that we want to hit, rather than kind of being exploratory on, okay, like we're going to set some target and then see what actually happens based off of like mainnet behavior. So that's really the main motivation behind this ACP. I don't think we're planning during this call to go over too much of the math, but if there are any specific questions on the math, I think that we will talk a little bit about parameterization towards the end of the call, or at least after Austin gives his presentation. So I think with that, that's kind of the background for why we're interested in this. So I think maybe Austin, if you want to share your screen and talk about some of the simulations that you ran.
Yeah, let me try to take it over. See if it works the first try or not. It's always hard. Let's see. Can you guys see? Awesome.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So before we start making radical changes to the way that we calculate our gas fees, it makes sense to test it a little bit, make sure it's actually mathematically sound. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to compare it with our historical data. Note that like we've been using this on the P chain, but Stephen kind of mentioned that with the minimum gas fee set high enough, we're not actually testing the dynamic fee mechanism. So we don't know very much about how it works yet. So below I have a graph. In blue, the gas fee over time on February 2nd, which you may or may not know, we had a huge fee spike. This peak up here is around 3,000 nanobucks, which is very, very high. And the minimum is 1. So you can see most of the time it spends very close to 1. But there's this huge spike. This is log scaled, by the way. What it actually looks like is this, which is rather drastic. And we can implement our new gas fee mechanism to estimate what the gas fees would have been if we had used our new mechanism. But there's a few flaws here. I'll talk about them in a second. But we can see that it does still spike with the high demand, which is good. But once the high demand's over, it goes back down much, much faster. There's not this huge gap right here where there's sustained high fees despite demand returning to normal. But I also want to show this graph here. And this is, Stephen mentioned that we don't actually hit the target that we establish. This red line is 1.5 million gas per second. And then the blue line is a rolling average of how much gas is consumed per second. And you can see very clearly that almost the entire time we are above this threshold for what we expect the target to be. So that's good to know that we can actually have much more gas consumed on our network than we expected, but it is something we should think about before we start setting our actual target for the new mechanism. So I do want to add a couple caveats here. I set some random, more or less, parameters for this. This is t equals 1.9 million, which is what I thought was where it was pretty clearly well above that for 30 minutes or more, which is a guess, and that's not great. But also, the more important flaw is that this data only includes the accepted transactions using the old fee mechanism. So it doesn't allow market feedback. It doesn't account for drop transactions and all sorts of other things. So this is not a very good experiment, I want to say. But it does show some interesting promise, where we can clearly see that the gas fee returns to normal at an exponential rate rather than this approximately linear one that we see. So I made a new experiment, and this is just a statistically random experiment. So I set the targets for what, if you read the ACP, you would know what all these different parameters are, but for our T, I set it at 2 million gas per second, which is about what the old mechanism targets for this experiment. You'll see later. And then each transaction is sampled from a normal distribution with the mean at 100 nanoblocks and the standard deviation relatively big. And there's also a mempool. So if the transaction isn't included in a block, it can be included in a later block. So the demand is in the bottom right here. it's this graph in green. So you can see most of the time there's very few transactions. It's like 50 transactions per second. And then every so often, there's a huge spike to 10,000 transactions per second, which we can't handle, really, with this experiment setup. And this is to see how the mechanism responds to a huge demand increase in a short period of time. So in blue, we have our old mechanism, which does about what we'd expect based off of our historical data, where it spikes pretty high, pretty fast, and then slowly decreases as our after our demand returns to normal. So you can see that the mempool is still not empty during this period of time. But even after it does empty, it still decreases at an approximately linear rate before the next demand spike, where it shoots right back up. And so it sustains well above the minimum that is necessary. But in orange, we have our exponential increase, but we have an exponential decrease afterward. And this is, I mean, the gas fees are lower, which is obviously good for people trying to issue their transactions. But we can also see that our like average gas per second over time is much higher during these periods of high demand. It essentially just overconsumes gas to keep the fees from raising too fast. But after it clears the mempool, we can go back to our normal transaction load, which is all very interesting stuff. Yeah. All right, and then I ran one last experiment here where I had a much larger mempool. So essentially, during the huge fee spike, the mempool filled up, and then before the next one, it didn't have the chance to empty. There were just too many transactions in there. So these demand spikes are too close together. And you can see this here, that neither mempool has the opportunity to completely empty, and that's going to skew our distribution up higher, but also it means there's going to be a lot of drop transactions, which is a worst case scenario. So here you can see in blue, the gas fee is relatively stable at around 120 nanovox, which makes sense. That's 2 standard deviations above where it's sampled from. And you can see in orange, there's these huge spikes, and then the decreases down, and then a huge spike, like instantaneous spike of up to 20%, and then it goes back down. And this is unintuitive, but it's due to a really large variation in block size. So all of a sudden, once the gas fee lowers, it can include a lot of blocks because or a lot of transactions, because our transactions are priced very similarly. So then there's a huge block, and then it shoots back up in gas fee, which is not good. This is certainly a flaw of our new design, or a flaw in the experiment. And we should probably talk more about this. But this only happens when the mempool doesn't have the opportunity to clear between demand increases. This is also relatively unrealistic because on the C-chain, the mempool is much smaller than this. My final simulation that I want to show you guys is comparing some different parameters. If you read the ACP, there's these ratios between our targeting parameter T and K and R. And K kind of defines the rate at which it exponentially increases. So in blue here, I have K equals 43, which is, it has, the gas fee can double in as little as 30 seconds, but no faster. And R defines the ratio with the capacity, I believe. And if you decrease this below 2, it actually skews the exponential decay to decay faster. And you can see this here, comparing the blue and the green, where it doesn't decay faster, it raises slower. So you can see that it raises much slower than the blue because the R ratio is much slower, but then it decreases at the same rate. And this is a lot of parameter tuning that we should talk about before accepting this ACP, because these are more or less arbitrary values. The 64.5K value corresponds to being able to double in 45 seconds. And for the demand curve here, I just used a big momentary spike as a block, and it sampled the same. So clearly our R value here, combined with the higher K value in red, this is just not reactive enough. We should probably only change one of these. And I think from talking to Steven, like R equals 1.5 is really small. We probably don't want to go that low. But yeah, here's all the graphs that I've made, all the simulations I've run. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them, or if Steven wants to fill in anything I missed.
Yeah, I think if there's any questions from anyone about the simulations, now would be a good time. I think the one interesting thing is if we go back to one further down. I think one interesting thing here about the base fee over time is those spikes are probably because the transactions within the mempool are very uniform, right? So like you're very quickly going from no one is willing to pay the fee to like a full block is being willing to pay for, which is why like the new mechanism spikes up and the old mechanism probably doesn't spike up as much because I think the old mechanism has a smaller block gas limit. And so you'll see like it ticks up quickly and then drops back down. So I think, yeah, it definitely happens that like the bigger capacity you have within a single block will result in bigger instantaneous jumps, which is that R value essentially. So yeah, that is interesting for sure. I think that some of the conversations in the Ethereum community around 1559 also fit in here. So there are conversations about, I guess there's kind of two different sides. One side is, well, if you want to increase the target, but you don't want your worst case block complexity to increase, then you can kind of decrease this like elasticity multiplier. Which basically says, we'll run hotter on average, but our worst case is still the same. So that's one reason to maybe decrease R. And then a reason to perhaps increase R is increasing R kind of allows you to handle instantaneous bursts of demand better. So let's say, okay, we're running normally, and then there is some huge load spike. Whether or not you actually want to increase the amount of transactions put on chain during that load spike to kind of allow people to have their transactions be included timely. So there's kind of like two different sides of like the R argument, which is certainly interesting. Yeah, the K.
I have a question about that actually.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So in this ACP, we're proposing that validators can like individually suggest what they decide or what they would want T to be based on like T in the last block. Why not also give them the ability to vote on the value of R? Why only? And how would we use an observed like kind of average or median value of T to adjust R in the future or down the road? It's kind of two different questions, sorry.
So we certainly could make any of these parameters dynamically configurable. The question is basically around just like complexity, like we could have, validators specify like a whole kind of matrix of things. But if it starts to get sufficiently complicated, then it gets a little interesting. So that is certainly an option. Yeah. The second question that you had is how does R relate to the target or sorry?
No, it was more so like given the ACP stays where it is and validators are only given T as their configurable or Q of T, how will the observed kind of, I guess, median or average value of T impact how R is set by the network?
So R is determining the so R is determining what the capacity per second is of the chain, and T is the target per second. So essentially, what R being set to 2 means is that the capacity of the chain is set to double whatever the target is. By setting it equal to the 2 times the target, the fees can go up just as quickly as they can go down. So, so in this graph, we can see when R is lower, they rise slower than they fall. So in most of the fee mechanisms, I would say that it's kind of typically set to this. I think Ethereum in their proposal for their next network upgrade is considering deviating from this a bit with the blob target. So the blob target, they're considering targeting 6 blobs per block with a capacity of 9, whereas their current is targeting 3 with a capacity of 6, I believe. So that's certainly that is certainly something that can be played with. But yeah, that's what R is. So R is determining the relationship between target and capacity. So if you change the target, R is not going to be in changing. What is the hardware config used for these tests? So these are all just direct simulations of the fee mechanism. They are not tests of the validation kind of stuff. This is not really changing the hardware requirements, because if the target is the same, then you're going to be processing the same amount of transactions over time. So this is just a change to the pricing mechanism. Yeah. There are some changes with respect to the capacity for block processing times. But that is not something that is a sustained load. That is more of the burst capacity. But yeah, good question. Yeah, so I think we've already kind of naturally flowed in, but I think that one of the main things that I think we want to get out of this is trying to finalize these parameters. I would say, so currently the ACP is set where K is 43, which means it can double and half at most every 30 seconds. Over a running period. So if you're at max capacity, it can double at most every 30 seconds over, repeated periods. There is still the instantaneous amount of change, which can instantaneously change the price, but over a long period of time. So say more than a single block, it gets rate limited to 30 seconds per doubling or halving.
That's cool, by the way.
Sorry, what?
That's in blue for everyone that's looking at the graph.
Yes. So that's what K is setting, basically, is that kind of doubling time. It's only doubling time if R is set to 2. If R is set to 1.5, I would have to actually redo the math out on the ratios. But yeah, currently on the P chain, K is set to result in doubling every 30 seconds. So that would definitely be the least rocking of the boat. But yeah, I guess are there any people with opinions on R and K? These are certainly things that we'll only really know kind of how reactive the mechanism is once it is live on mainnet. It's just hard to actually take, the load because it is kind of a self-referential mechanism based off of people's behaviors and the fees. So it's definitely possible that, after this ACP, if it were to get activated, there could be a follow-up ACP to increase K to smoothen it out or to change R later. Certainly possible as well. But yeah, I don't know if there are any kind of thoughts on people that have any opinions on these two parameters,
So I actually
including
have a
Austin.
question, just because I think earlier you said when R is set to 2 that the fee rises as fast as it falls. But in these diagrams, it really looks like, especially for the green line where K is 33 and R is 1.5 and not 2, that it's rising almost as fast as it's falling. So
Yeah, I mean, go ahead. Austin.
I was going to say, also something funny and quirky about this experiment that makes it a little funny shaped is the mempool. That's why it doesn't just like cap out like a mountain, completely flat, and then go down exponentially as well. But yeah, Stephen, you can finish whatever you wanted to say.
So if you look at, say, the blue line, so in the top graph, if you look at, I think I can actually highlight stuff. Can I not?
you should have the ability to like draw on the screen.
Okay, I'm not gonna figure this out. So for the blue line in the top graph versus, say, the green line in the top graph, so you can see the green line increases much slower than the blue line, right? But the green line actually decreases as quickly as the blue line, right? So by decreasing R, you are making it so that it increases slower, but it decreases at the same rate in this experiment. So if you look at, say, the blue line and the orange line, by keeping R the same and just increasing K, you are making it less reactive on the up and on the down side. Yeah, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, that makes more sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we'll just kind of pick some parameters that we are happy with, or we'll need to pick some parameters that we're happy with, and kind of just see how it goes, just because it is hard to actually simulate like real mainnet demand. So changing the K multiplier and potentially the R multiplier as well, definitely something that, will take some tuning based off of the mainnet kind of observability. I don't know if there's any last things that anyone wants to talk about with respect to K and R, any opinions, numbers specifically that they want to push. I don't know. Feel free also to chime in here, Austin, as well, because I think you've been lost in the sauce of the algo for quite a while.
Yeah, I feel like you pretty much covered most of it. I don't know if it totally makes sense to raise R above 2, but change like this red graph, for example, I don't think we should be decreasing R by this much and put K that high, because we can see that 3 minutes later, the gas fee is still barely risen despite having a huge demand. And that's not reactive enough to address any issues that might come up regarding our load. So I think this red one is awful. I don't think we should do this one. I think we should probably stick to a much higher value of R than 1.5, maybe 1.7 or so. And if K equals 43 is much closer to our current mechanism, it might be nice to not rock the boat too much.
Yeah. Cool. I think so the next thing on my list of things to point out, I did want to just also, by the way, thank you, Austin, for going through all these graphs. That was super nice. Going back, I just wanted to stress again, because I know that there has been confusion of this sometimes. Changing of the minimum gas price does decrease the fees during periods of low demand, but it does not always decrease the price. So I just wanted to stress that during these higher fee spikes, I think all of our simulations in the previous graphs were kind of starting from the same base fee for the mechanisms. So this will have a smaller base fee. So, the fees are able to go lower with this new mechanism as proposed with the smaller M value. But that does not necessarily mean that the fees will always be like less. This is kind of a less important value than I think some people may think at the surface. And then I think the last thing is to just kind of talk a little bit briefly about the modifications to the target. So the modifications to the target, say like gas limit, essentially the way it's going to work is whenever someone proposes a block, they're able to increase or decrease the target by a small amount. It fixes some inaccuracies in, say, the 1559 mechanism where it's more willing to decrease than increase, but it's not super relevant. But the main kind of thing that I think from the implementation side, and this actually isn't really talked about too much in the ACP, but I'm interested to hear people's thoughts on it, is how should default values of this targeting mechanism be specified? So block builders are able to configure and set their values however they want. But inside of the actual code, we'll have to specify some rule for actually setting that target. So I think the two kind of options for default values that have been thrown around is one, that the default value is just whatever the current value is on chain. So basically, if a validator doesn't care, they can just kind of take that. And then the other question for a default, or the other option for a default value, is that just within the code, there is some specified default value. This is a very much an implementation detail, but I think it is important to kind of like get a community conversation around it, because this can result in changes to how the mechanism works. So for instance, if in the code we were to set a concrete default value, what that practically means is that if there aren't people that care that much in the validator community to like set this value explicitly, then whatever the default value is almost certainly going to be the actual value, which puts a lot of kind of onus of this value into the people that maintain, say, like Avalanche Go and Core ETH to like set that default value. The alternative is that it defaults to whatever's on chain. And so then essentially, if you're abstaining, you're not really moving the needle at all. But what that means is that perhaps a much smaller portion of network validators could change the target if a large percentage of validators are abstaining. So I'm interested if there's any kind of opinions from the community across those two mechanisms. Yeah, on the implementation side, it's very easy, but it's basically a question of like default values within Avalanche Go and Core ETH. And now, of course, if people have modified clients, so on and so forth, then they can set whatever values they want, similarly to how validators will be able to set this via config. But yeah, I'm just interested if there's any kind of thoughts.
I think it's a very interesting question. And I think that the latter option, basically the option where there is no default, you either have your bias that you have set on your validator or you default to the target on chain, kind of like pseudo reminds me of like the electoral college, like less people get to decide for everybody what they want them to vote for, versus like having a kind of prescribed ideal target kind of gives more, I guess, it gives more weight to the network itself deciding what it thinks a healthy target should be. And given a low enough participation rate, then the votes of those participating based on their stake weight might not matter if people don't participate, if validators don't set a target. So I think that having it set as a default value could actually incentivize people to participate in that, because if they see a target value that they don't necessarily agree is the ideal target value, then they are incentivized to use their stake to vote on a different one. So I kind of like that a bit better than having it default to the chain's default, only because it incentivizes participation from validators of the network. Otherwise, I don't think we would really go wrong with either. So it's just kind of an interesting, maybe tragedy of the commons style ethics dilemma.
Cool. Anyone else have any kind of thoughts?
Just one, that these defaults, regardless of how we choose them, are going to be in addition to limits, right? Both like higher bound and lower bound, right?
Currently in the ACP, there is no specified higher bound. There is a lower bound just based off of the mechanism. Let me find it. And the lower bound is set to something that is significantly less than the current C-Chain value. But yeah, currently there is not a upper bound specified in the ACP.
Do you think that we would benefit from setting an upper bound to prevent someone from maliciously trying to set it to a too high of a value?
So the way that the mechanism works, so assuming we go with, say, the second option where basically people default to whatever is on chain for their vote, essentially the way the mechanism will work is it will target whatever the median proposal target is for weighted by stake. So yeah, so essentially, like if someone is trying to set it up to infinity, then you would have to have some large amount of stake to actually guarantee that, assuming validators don't want that value to be set to infinity. You know, as system designers, we could specify a maximum. I don't know how important it is to set a maximum. Yeah. The effective maximum within the code would be, you know, max uint 64 gas per second. But yeah, we can certainly add it. Like,
yeah, it just because it's kind of like dynamic value, right? And we could have some bugs in the code that related to calculating that dynamic value. And so I'm like, well, if that goes too high, that could be an issue. So maybe we should kind of like limit it to a value where the system would work, would still be functional, even if it would set to that high value.
yeah. I would say bugs in the code are problematic at all levels. But yeah, also to answer Ron's question, it does prevent overflows, for the record.
I mean,
yeah.
one other, just to play devil's advocate, doesn't having a higher gas target and gas consumption rate potentially lead to state management issues for validators like down the road? Like if we're accepting larger blocks and the network is becoming sizably larger, to think it'll affect bootstrapping times and it'll affect the average cost to run a validator and potentially start cutting into validators' stake rewards. So that could somewhat naturally disincentivize them from setting it too high.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind until it becomes a problem. So
Yeah, I would definitely say that this ACP is not about changing the gas target. It is about making it so that the validators can select the gas target, right? So I definitely think that the current kind of ecosystem sentiment, so across multiple blockchains, is trying to like push the gas target higher. And so I definitely think that, it'll be important to communicate like the responsible increase of the gas target to validators. But I'm probably not particularly concerned with like a large percentage of the validators just setting it to max uint64 and just rip it. Because as you said, right, like they won't be able to process that amount of gas. Like they will fall out of the network, at some level, and then they won't get their staking rewards, get marked offline. Like these validators have to have a large amount of a box to be voting on because this is a stake weighted mechanism. So like, if people pump the gas to some max uint64 value, well, they have already locked all of this Vox, right? And now the C-chain's in a weird spot. Like it's not really incentive aligned for someone to do something like this. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I think those are the main things that I wanted to go over. And I think we still have like 15 minutes or so. I don't know if there's any kind of additional questions about the overall mechanism, parameters, simulations, additional thoughts. About anything.
I definitely encourage anybody who has questions or thoughts after the end of this meeting to comment on the GitHub discussion. Like to see it be very active, and this is definitely a ton of multivariable calculation stuff. So if anything isn't clear, just ask. We want to make sure that these changes are as transparent as possible.
Sure. Yeah, if you have a question outside of 176, feel free.
I think they're probably typing. You can feel free to come off mute too if you want.
Yeah, hello. Am I audible? Like I was checking the GitHub, so I saw the simplex thing and I was reading it like, are you guys planning to change the L1 consensus or something like that with simplex?
No. So the intent of simplex is to be used as an optional consensus protocol for small networks, like for L1s.
So like it will be like I can switch between I can select the I guess it's Avalanche consensus or Snowman consensus, Snowman plus plus. I always mess up, but or simplex, right?
Yeah. So according to what I know, there are no plans regarding replacing the consensus protocol of the C-chain, but it will be intended, at least for the foreseeable future, to be used as the consensus protocol for L1s.
By the way, is there any architectural or like documentation of the code of Avalanche Go, like people who wanted to study it?
I would say Avalanche Go has readmes of varying quality for the major components. So if you look at like the networking package, it goes over P2P stuff, pure discovery, message handling. If you go to the Snow package, it goes over like message routing and like how the consensus engine and VMs interact. So I don't know that there is like a holistic kind of entry point, but for any of like the major packages, there's typically a corresponding README that goes over stuff. So yeah, I think that that's probably the closest thing that we have right now for that.
We have in the API references section of the docs this document that was updated last year by Josh, I believe, which goes through very, very high level the flow of a single blockchain in the Avalanche network, which might be helpful for like an introduction to how at least the mainnet chains build blocks and how they network with each other. But like Steven said, there are readmes throughout Avalanche Go. And if there is anything specific you'd like to know, you can open an issue in GitHub, as well as try and check out some of the documentation on the actual doc site. Yep.
Cool. I think with that, unless anyone else has anything, I think that we're probably good with the 176 presentation.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you everybody for joining and participating. Thanks, Austin, for the insights and those very, very useful simulations. And we'll see you in the GitHub discussion thread.
Thanks,
Take
everyone.
care.